New Orleans, 1890. The future looks bright. Only 4 years before had a city-wide electric lighting system been introduced, and over the course of the next decade, much of the city's transportation system, reliant up until then on mule-drawn streetcars and steam locomotives, would too be electrified. Little did the people of New Orleans know a single act of violence would forever change the course of American history. It was raining on the night of October 15, 1890, as then Chief of Police David C. Hennessy and Captain William O'Connor left the Central Police Station. Each walked in opposite directions as Chief Hennessy turned towards Basin Street. Seldom did he walk alone. For the past 3 years he had been accompanied by bodyguards on the short voyage back to the home he shared with his widowed mother. On that night, however, he walked alone. As Hennessy approached his doorstep, gunfire rang out into the night. Bullets whizzed by, one fracturing his leg, as another cut through his liver before settling in his chest. He pulled out his weapon, returning fire, but it was too late. The group of assassins had already vanished into the night. Having heard the gunshots, Captain O'Connor came running, only to find Chief Hennessy covered in blood, calling out, "Billy, Billy, they have given it to me, and I gave it back the best I could." "Who did this, Dave?" O'Connor asked, to which Hennessy replied, "Dagos," an ethnic slur referring to Italians. Hennessy's funeral had been the largest since Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Behind a glass display laid the open casket. Reporting on the grandeur of the funeral, the New York Times wrote, "All day long the people crowded into the city hall to view the body, and it was almost impossible to reach the bier." The assassination was not entirely surprising. An ongoing feud between the Provenzano and Mantranga crime families had been further fueled by an approaching appeals trial for several of the Provenzano's men Hennessy had put in prison. According to reports, Hennessy had new evidence, which if offered at the trial, would clear the Provenzanos but implicate the Mantrangas. A friend of Hennessy's and fellow policeman would later testify Hennessy had no such evidence. Up until now, however, the true identities of the killers were unknown. Chief Hennessy had not been able to identify his attackers. Nevertheless, New Orleans Mayor Joseph A. Shakespeare continued to blame the assassination on the mafia, dubbing the murder an act of, quote, Sicilian vengeance, before telling police to, quote, scour the whole neighborhood, arrest every Italian you come across. The American press and public agreed with the mayor's sentiments, all jumping to the conclusion the assassins were Italians. Even the local papers openly blamed, quote, Dagos for the assassination, noting that some of the shotguns found near the crime scene were imported from Italy. In fact, however, they were manufactured by the W. Richards Company. In the first 24 hours, 45 Italian men had been arrested. Over the coming days, some 200 more would be rounded up and brought into custody. Crowds formed outside the police station, screaming obscenities and assaulting both the male and female relatives of the suspects. One of the suspects, Antonio Scafidi, was shot in the neck by 29-year-old newspaper salesman Thomas Duffy at point-blank range. Duffy was sentenced to only 6 months in prison. Scafidi survived the attack, only to be lynched months later. Ultimately, 19 men were charged and held without bail in parish prison. While no witness had seen any of the suspects' faces, the thought of Hennessy's assailants being anything other than Italian was never considered. Across the country, Italian-American newspapers interpreted the situation in New Orleans as it truly was, an attack on Italian immigrants, not on the mafia. Of the 19 men charged, 9 were put on trial, including that of Antonio Scafidi. The jury selection process was unusually long, as more than 700 prospective jurors were rejected for reasons such as a hatred of Italians, opposition to the death penalty, or for being Italian. The trial commenced on February 16, 1891, with Judge Joshua G. Baker presiding. From the beginning, it was clear the prosecution lacked substantial evidence. The murder had been committed on a dark street on a rainy night in a city known for its corruption. Eyewitnesses attempted to identify the suspects solely by their clothing. Even Captain O'Connor, the first of Hennessy's aide, was not called to testify. The trial concluded on March 13, 1891, to a clear verdict of not guilty for 6 of the men, and a mistrial declared for the remaining 3. The 6 acquitted Italians, however, were not released, and instead ordered back into confinement in the parish prison. On the morning of Tuesday, March 17, 1891, a headline in the Indianapolis Journal read, "Story of the Murder Retold." In it, William S. Parkerson, a citizen of New Orleans and former campaign manager to Mayor Shakespeare, would go on to recount the events that followed the trial. I had no connection with the case beyond taking a good citizen's interest in it and dropping into court once or twice to see how it was getting along. When I got here, I found a large number of citizens awaiting me. They were talking about the outrageous verdict and told me they had come to ask me to take some measures to right it. After 10 minutes conversation, we adjourned to meet again that evening. We all signed a call that was published in the next morning's papers, asking citizens to assemble at 10 o'clock Saturday morning at Clay Statue, and saying we would be prepared to carry out their instructions. Meaning that you would be ready to kill the prisoners, Parkerson's interviewer asked, to which he replied, "That was the feeling we understood of the public pulse." That next morning, Parkerson arrived at the statue of Henry Clay to find a mob of thousands gathered around it. Parkerson spoke to the crowd, and according to the New York Sun stated, quote, "I desire neither fame, nor name, nor glory. I'm a plain American citizen, and as such, and as a good citizen, I am here. I am here to say that things have come to such a crisis that talk is idle. Action must be the thing now." The crowd cheered. From the statue, we started for the prison, Parkerson continued in his recount of the events. I leading and the crowd following us. We had to walk about a mile, and as we walked along, people came from side streets and fell into the procession. The women were crying, and the men cheering. It was the most terrible thing I ever saw. The quiet determination of the crowd. There was no disorder. As the mob worked to break down both the front and side door, the guards inside the prison released the innocent Italian prisoners, allowing them to find hiding places. 14-year-old Gasparo Marchesi hid under a box across the hallway from his father, Antonio. As the side door was broken open and the angry mob entered, prisoners pointed out where the Italians were hiding. One after another, they were murdered. Fruit peddler Antonio Bagnetto, stevedore James Caruso, tinsmith Loretto Comitas, stevedore Rocco Gerasi, fruit importer Joseph Macheca, fruit peddler Antonio Marchesi, cobbler Pietro Monasterio, ward politician Frank Romero, fruit peddler Antonio Scafidi, and rice plantation laborer Charles Trena. As the mob pulled little Gasparo from his hiding place, the New York Times wrote of how, in grief, he tried to tear out his eyes upon learning of his father's death. Antonio Bagnetto, having been shot in the head, was dragged outside and hanged from a tree anyways. Most of the Italians, as reported by the Times, had been shot through the brain and made a horrible sight as they lay weltering in blood and brains. The mob grabbed street vendor Emanuele Polizzi, strung him up, and hanged him by a nearby tree. The rope snapped. The crowd lifted Polizzi back up and strung him up again. In a final attempt at survival, Polizzi tried pulling himself up by the rope, Angered by this, a member of the mob punched him in the face, and his hands were bound. No longer could he keep himself from hanging. As his dead body lay hanging from the tree, the crowd cheered, firing a slew of bullets into the corpse, grabbing at him for souvenirs. After all had been said and done, 11 Italian men had been murdered, 2 higher a number than the number of men who had actually faced trial, and 8 higher than the number who had yet been acquitted. When Parkerson was later asked by his interviewer how he could justify the mass murder of confined, unarmed men, Parkerson stated, quote, "We looked upon these men as so many reptiles." The newspapers across the country applauded the lynch mob. "Chief Hennessy avenged," read the headline of the New York Times. "Mafia murders slain, 11 Sicilian butchers lynched at New Orleans," exclaimed the Chicago Daily Tribune. "Slayers slain, the Hennessy assassins done to death," wrote the Los Angeles Times. These sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins, who have transported to this country the lawless passions, the cutthroat practices, and the oath-bound societies of their native country, are to us a pest without mitigations. These men of the Mafia killed Chief Hennessy in circumstances of peculiar atrocity. Lynch law was the only course open to the people of New Orleans to stay the issue of a new license to the Mafia to continue its bloody practices. The New York Times editorial board, March 16, 1891. In the time that followed, Mayor Shakespeare and his political allies worked to further limit the political and economic power of the Italian community, passing a law giving control of the docks to a new company run by one of the lynch mob leaders. Italians were barred entry into the local longshoremen's union, and a further amendment to the state constitution used to disenfranchise blacks also made it difficult for Italian immigrants to vote. In May of 1891, the Italian consul left New Orleans. The Italian government demanded justice against the lynch mob and its leaders, as well as reparations which were to be paid to the families of the dead Italian men. When the United States federal government declined to prosecute the leaders of the lynch mob, both Italy and the U.S. recalled their ambassadors. Rumors of war began to spread. Thousands of telegrams poured into the White House from citizens volunteering to fight in a war against Italy. A federal investigation into the lynchings commenced. Soon after, the evidence gathered against the Italian men, as reported by Federal District Attorney William Grant, was found to be exceedingly unsatisfactory and inconclusive. There was no evidence to link any of the men to the Mafia. The investigation then looked into the Mafia in New Orleans and came to find a lack of evidence as to whether it even existed. With nowhere left to turn, the United States government finally caved, providing an indemnity to the dead men's families of close to $25,000. President Benjamin Harrison even called the lynching a most deplorable and discreditable incident. Harrison would go on to lose the presidential election of 1892 against Grover Cleveland, the very man he had beaten 4 years prior. The court case of 1891 introduced the word mafia to the American public. Newspapers would go on to use the word freely, often linking the crimes of Italian citizens to those of organized crime, even when no evidence of a connection existed. Fabricated rumors circulated through the newspapers, stating thousands of Italians were plotting to attack New Orleans and were vandalizing railroads in New York and Chicago. For the better part of the next century, these newspaper accounts would go on to become primary sources of information on the trial and lynchings, with the guilt of the accused men rarely called into question. And while the stereotypes of Italians carried on, the once widespread knowledge of the 1891 lynchings seemed to fade.